Good morning. My name is Shika Kofi, and I have the pleasure of introducing Katherine Blakeslee. Ms. Blakeslee began her international development career in London at the International Planned Parenthood Federation. After she returned to the United States and worked for the United States Agency for International Development, better known as USAID. There, she held a variety of roles, including Associate Assistant Administrator on the Bureau for Policy and Program Coordinator. She served as Senior Policy Advisor on Conflict Prevention, Mitigation, and Peace Building in the Office of the Administrator. Most recently at USAID, she was the Director of Office of Women in Development and Coordinator of USAID's anti-human trafficking activities. Since 2012, Ms. Blakeslee has been at the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine, where she focuses on global violence prevention and child exploitation for commercial sex and labor. In addition to her international work, Ms. Blakeslee is a watercolorist, and both she and her daughter are graduates of Wellesley College. Please help me in welcoming Ms. Blakeslee. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeannie Wu, and today I have the pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Sally Engle Merry to all of you. Professor Merry graduated from Wellesley in 1966 and obtained her MA in Princeton University in 1967, followed by a PhD from Brandeis University in 1978. Professor Merry taught at her alma mater here at Wellesley, where she was Marion Butler McLean Professor in the History of Ideas in the Department of Anthropology for many years until 2005. After that, she has moved to New York University and is now currently the faculty co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School of Law, as well as a past president of the American Anthropological Society, which she is still very active nowadays. Professor Merry was recently inducted as the Silver Professor in October 2013, joining a prestigious group of NYU faculty members who hold the same title. Despite moving to a new teaching environment, Professor Merry has remained a very strong and close relationship with us at Wellesley, for she is a senior scholar at our very own Wellesley Centers for Women. Professor Merry is a very well-celebrated author and editor of at least, I counted last time 10 books, and actually Professor Merry didn't really count, so she couldn't verify with me, but multiple books and over 100 articles, as we can tell by her being referenced quite often in the previous session by Professor Selimovich. And for example, one of her works titled Human Rights and Gender Violence, Translating International Law into Local Justice, was a 2010 winner of J.I. Stelly Prize for the School for Advanced Research. There's so many more things that I can tell you about Professor Merry, but I think there's nothing better than hearing it from herself, especially on the topic on globalization and human trafficking together with other two panelists. So please help me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Professor Merry.
And our final panelist is Ms. Sahana Dharmapuri, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Known as the Gender Advisor, Ms. Dharmapuri provides policy advice and training in relation to gender, peace, and security issues. She has counseled a wide variety of institutions, including USAID, NATO, the Swedish Armed Forces, and the United States Institute for Peace. Her job has taken her across the world to countries like Rwanda, India, Turkey, Israel and the West Bank, and Thailand, to name just a few. She has published book chapters, articles, and monographs on women, peace, and security issues. She has received great recognition for her work. She was a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and an Investing in Women in Development Fellow at the United States Agency for International Development. In 2000, she was invited by Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama's Foundation for Universal Responsibility in New Delhi to conceptualize and facilitate their first conflict transformation workshop for young women in India and Pakistan. She is currently a member of both the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security and the American Council of Young Political Leaders. Ms. Dharmapuri is a board member of Made by Survivors, an anti-trafficking organization dedicated to caring for the survivors of trafficking. She is co-founder and serves on the Executive Leadership Committee of the Harvard Alumni Network for Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development. She received her master's in Middle East Studies and Public Policy from the University of Chicago, and her BA in Anthropology, also from the University of Chicago. We're all very excited to have you here. Please give a warm welcome to Ms. Dharmapuri and the rest of our panelists.
Down, okay. I'm really happy to be back here at Wellesley again, particularly for the Albright Institute, because I'm very pleased that Wellesley is hosting this. And I have spent my career in international work, so I think that this particular institute is really important for Wellesley. Today, I want to talk about human trafficking and globalization. And let me show you one of the reasons why I want to talk about that. I lived in London for 9 years after Wellesley, and I lived 3 doors from this house. And so for 9 years, at least twice a day, I walked past this plaque which said, "William Wilberforce, opponent of slavery, died here." Well, I didn't think about it then till I was back a few years ago and walked past it again, and I was working on human trafficking, and I thought, wait a minute. We thought it was over back then. That's what I thought in Wellesley. Well, more into this. Yeah. It was actually 150 years ago that Abraham Lincoln put the Emancipation Proclamation. And here we are, 150 years later, talking about it. So I think that it's really important issue that we face. And there has been a lot of confusion about what it exactly is. So I wanted to start with a question and ask you all, what one word would you most associate with human trafficking? Yes?
Slavery.
Okay.
Informal.
Okay. Yes?
Women.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Trap.
What did you say?
Trap.
Trap. Yes?
Organized.
Uh-huh.
Violence.
Mm-hmm.
Tragedy.
Anybody? Yes? Okay. Well, yes, go ahead.
Corruption.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Control.
Mhm.
Hidden.
Well, I think that given all of these different words that come to mind in thinking about this, we can see why it is confusing sometimes to people about what exactly it is and what approach we take to that. So it's a business. First of all, it's a business. It's for profit, and it's in the top 3 with trafficking of drugs and weapons. And it seems to have become more profitable. It's a process. The word trafficking is a little bit misleading because it implies that it's the act of taking somebody across some border. But it could be that the exploitation happens afterward. It could be that it happens immediately if someone, say, is kidnapped. So trafficking is a word that's brought about some confusion, and a lot of the human trafficking in the world is done internally within a country. Take India. I mean, it's a big country. You can go from one side of the country to the other. You don't have to come from Bangladesh or Nepal or someplace else. Human trafficking is a renewable resource. It's not like drugs and guns where once you sell it, you have to get some more inventory to sell again. It's a human being. You can sell them many times a day and a night. One of the problems is the measurement of human trafficking, and I think you'll hear some more about that because it's hidden, because sometimes the victims won't even identify as a victim of trafficking because of stigma and other things. It's very difficult to get exact numbers on this, and there have been efforts to, and there are a lot of estimates out there, but they're all estimates. human trafficking varies by country and by region. In the former Soviet states and Eastern Europe and China and some Central America, there's some organized criminal gangs running it. In other places, it's much more a small, loose network or a mom and pop kind of operation. It's commonly gets a criminal justice lens looking at it. So then the focus goes on prosecution. But that also means it's coming after the fact. It's after the person has already been trafficked. And the number of prosecutions relative to the number of trafficking victims is insignificant, completely insignificant. I mean, and this is an estimate, but it's thrown around that there are 27 million victims of human trafficking, but prosecutions were only 7,703 and convictions only 4,700. Well, that's not an approach that's going to end this. It may be necessary, but not significant. And I wanted to show you another slide. Labor trafficking has been ignored in favor of sex trafficking to a degree. And that's unfortunate. We need to pay more attention to it. Actually, the prevalence of labor trafficking seems to be greater than sex trafficking, but sex trafficking has grabbed the attention. And there are both males and females involved, as you can see, in labor. So it's a very complicated thing, and we have to look at it with a number of different lenses. The U.S. government has a trafficking in persons report every year, and I think you've received the electronic version of that, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about that. The forms of trafficking is another thing that can confuse the issue because there are so many different forms. And there's another fisherman. And this is something that has gone on in a number of places, but examples are that Cambodians are trafficked into Thailand, men, and they're put on fishing boats, and they're often given drugs to keep them working, and sometimes the fishing boats stay out for 2 years. And when they come back, they might be completely sort of out of their minds from these drugs. And when the Thai government picks them up, they can just dump them over the border into Cambodia. And I have met some of these men. They didn't have any shelters for men, so a military base on the border between Thailand and Cambodian, took these young men in. The only treatment seemed to be sports. So they had a lot of heavy sports. They had basketball, they had other things. They didn't have drugs, they didn't have anything else. They were just exercising them. There are now shelters for men, at least in that part of Thailand they started it. Now, something that I want to really focus on is that most of the awareness has come through these individual dramatic stories, particularly around sex trafficking. And it gets awareness, and it gets people really concerned about the issue. But it's not the whole picture. It's not just one victim and one trafficker. It's the whole entire ecosystem. And with globalization, that has increased. So that's a point that I want to emphasize here, is that we have globalization. It's not going away. We have a lot more travel. We have the internet. We have consumption rising, so that calls for cheap labor. And we have the need for things like coltan, which goes into cell phones, which is mined in Africa. And then you all may have heard about conflict diamonds and gold that is mined by people who may be trafficked into them. So basically, there is lifelong damage to the individual who has been exploited in this way, and sometimes to the next generation, sometimes to the children who are born in this situation if their mother is forced into commercial sex or labor. And sometimes the same thing happens to the children, or they end up street children, and then they're really vulnerable. Another issue is that often they're trafficked by friends or relatives or acquaintances, so there's some kind of trust there, and then that's broken because they end up nearly duped in another country by somebody that they trusted, taken somewhere and end up in a brothel thinking that they're going to another kind of job, like in a restaurant or something. And poverty is a great sort of structural, systemic thing behind this. But so is the internet, so is travel, so is consumption. So I think we need to focus some more on the whole picture and the context. And you all come from different majors and different disciplines. And I think putting that all together to say, well, what role does this have in human trafficking is important. So as another instance of the type of trafficking, this is in Pattaya, Thailand. And this is a brothel. It's not very hidden. And I just want to say that these last three slides are taken and should be credited to someone called Kay Chernish. Kay is a photographer who has taken up this issue, and the Department of State contracted her to take the photographs. The first one on Wilberforce I had taken, but the others are credited to Kay Chernish. So what happens in the interplay between the micro level and the individual and the macro level, the big picture? Well, at the micro level, there's lack of economic opportunity, education, and sometimes what happens when a family has an emergency, either somebody gets sick or somebody dies or there's a financial emergency, the children end up having to go out and get work. So if somebody comes along and offers their parents money and says, we'll take them, to the city, we'll get them a job in a restaurant or something, they end up going. So for these reasons too, some have the need or the desire to migrate for work, or sometimes parental expectations. And those are different in different parts of the world. In some places, it's the girls who are expected to get some kind of financial support for their family, and the boys that end up going to school. There's also a lot of violence against women, which is both takes place in the home and outside by strangers. And then there are cultural practices. There's one in Haiti, and it's where the children are sent to live with another family, presumably because the other family is better off and can educate them and take care of them. And those children are called restivex, and they're quite vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. In Paraguay, this system, these children are called criatades, and it's estimated that there are 40,000 aged 6 to 12 in Paraguay. Lack of citizenship is another issue. The Burmese in Thailand who've come across the border because of the violence in Burma, the hill tribes in Thailand who weren't given citizenship, and then you have in Burma the Rohingya, who are Muslim, but they were born often in Burma, and so Bangladesh says, no, they don't belong here, and Burma says, no, they don't belong here. And so that's been responsible for a lot of the violence going on in Burma recently. So then what are the systemic things? Well, there's gender and ethnic discrimination. You probably know about this, and that's ended up causing a gender imbalance in births in India. So there are many more men than women. So then they need to find women somewhere. There's economic inequity, and this inequity issue is a really important one. There's political and social upheaval, and this often leaves in its wake very vulnerable people, family separations, displacements of populations. And we see this having gone on in the former Soviet Union, now in Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Africa. And there's no rule of law. There's no good social structure left. And there's violence all around. And you end up having sometimes child soldiers in this environment. And sometimes there are quite a number of them, and girls as well as boys. Another systemic one is globalization and information communications technology. That can cross over borders, and it can make itself disappear. They can pull things down from websites if they have to. They use disposable cell phones, and those can be used for better and worse. There's travel and tourism, and that has increased immensely since 1960. And then there are the large international events, whether they be the Olympics, the World Cup, and there's a great deal of concern about the trafficking there. And it could be children being forced to beg or begging. It could be sexual exploitation. It could be even in terms of labor. As our consumption demands grow and grow and grow for clothing, for food, minerals, gold, we want it cheap. And the extractive industries want to provide it cheaply. GDP gains, that's another reason why some countries have not tackled this. It's estimated that in 1998 that between 2 and 14% of the GDP from trafficking and sex tourism was in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. So if those countries are getting 2 to 14% of their GDP off of this business, that lessens their desire to stop it and take action. And then there are some policies. China's one-child family policy has left another gender imbalance with a lot more boys. And then there's the presence of the militaries. So I want to just say, okay, where are we today as opposed to maybe 25 years ago? Well, the downside has been the rapid change of this communication technology and how it's very difficult to keep up with it because the people who are using it for nefarious ways they're quite clever, and they're using it and they're moving with it. And for the law enforcement to keep up, that's a huge effort. There's child pornography, and that seems to be growing. And there's the selling and grooming of children through child pornography. In Britain, they just arrested this week some Britons who were running a live sex-on-demand webcast with children in the Philippines, and people could pay and say what they wanted to be done. And these children in the Philippines were forced to do it so that these pedophiles in Britain could watch it. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty nefarious use of the internet, and that, of course, we know has grown. The demand for younger children, and part of this is for virgins, and part of this is because of the fear of HIV and that they won't be infected. And finally, international travel. I said it had increased, but in 1960 there were 25 million trips abroad. In 2012, there were 1 billion. So that's a 6% annual increase. And then we all know that we've had economic downturns in recent years. Now I want to say something about the better use of technology in these things. Microsoft and Dartmouth put together something called PhotoDNA in 2009. and New Zealand and Microsoft are using this to track images on the internet and that are exploiting or endangering children and to take them down. There's another technological thing with crowdsourcing. And this started in Kenya. It's called ushahidi, which in Swahili meant testimony. It was started during the political troubles in the Rift Valley after in the run-up and after elections. And what it does is, in real time, it allows people to report where there is violence going on. Could be violence against women, could be political violence, could be trafficking. So ushahidi was started there, but it's been used for other violence identification reasons in Cairo, called Harass Map, in Delhi, and other places. And, you know, it could be used, I don't know that it is yet, but to target hotels that have a lot of sex tourism going on. Because once it's in real time, this information is put out in the public, and it's quite embarrassing. It not only tells people where not to go if it's violence against women, but, you know, those neighborhoods are kind of upset to be put on the map as a really bad place, and hotels would equally be upset. So that's another thing that could be used. Cross-border agreements between countries should be used. I mean, there's a cross-border agreement between Cambodia and Vietnam and between Cambodia and Thailand. The United States doesn't have one with Mexico or Canada. It's unfortunate that the United States has been behind in admitting that we have a problem here. We have been in denial. And therefore, the rest of the world is a little bit ahead of us in tackling this problem. They may have a bigger problem, but they're also ahead. And we have contributed to that by putting out the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, which has embarrassed these other countries and put them under pressure. But we didn't put ourselves in that report till a couple of years ago when Hillary Clinton said, we need to be in that too. So it put pressure on other countries and they had to do something, but we left ourselves off it. So we really are behind. There are some regional and national mechanisms. There's the Southeast Asia Regional Cooperation mechanism, and they have a section that works on trafficking. There's one in the Mekong Delta called COMMIT, and then there's training going on. So I think the interventions we need now have to go beyond awareness. We need measurement, and that's very difficult, incredibly difficult. We need collective, multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary approaches. We need governments, NGOs, private sector, corporations to work together. And fortunately, some of the corporations have now taken it on as their issue. We need governance to end corruption. We need to work on demand reduction, and that takes behavior change and culture change. And on the supply side, we need to still keep working to provide opportunities to young people so that they do not end up in this situation. Finally, we need resources and political will. And I want to just say one last thing, and that's about the special case of this sex tourism. There is an organization called ECPAT, End Child Prostitution, Pornography, and Trafficking. And they put out a code of conduct which has been signed by over 1,000 airlines, hospitality organizations, and some other businesses, for example, like Google. And the code of conduct is not legally binding, but it calls on these corporations to give training to their employees, to maybe provide employment opportunities for victims. There's also shareholder advocacy, and it's interesting because the Catholic organizations of nuns have gotten together, and there's some investment. They have some investment companies which invest the pensions of nuns, and then they go to shareholder meetings, and they, vote against companies that won't tackle this problem, and they have been a quite formidable force. They got Delta Airlines to sign this code of conduct. wasn't too keen on it, but the Catholic Sisters of Mercy got him to sign it. So I think I want to end with saying that we need to take the whole picture into account. We can't just say this poor person was trafficked and this trafficker needs to go to jail, because that's one person at a time. And we're not taking into account all of these other factors. I mean, globalization is not going to go away, so we have to figure out how to deal with it. It makes the situation much more complex. But I think that's where we have to be in the future. So thank you very much.
I'm going to stand over here because I can't give lectures sitting down. So it's delightful to be here again. I noticed Jenny didn't tell you how long I taught here at Wellesley because it would have been a little embarrassing, but it was actually 30 years. I'll admit it. I taught a course in this very room on Introduction to Peace and Justice Studies, and really got the Peace and Justice Studies program going, which I gather is still doing pretty well, right? And took the first group of students to India. We did in 2000. And it's been really a pleasure for me to see the students that I have worked with over the years now doing important work as professors in international arenas. Wellesley's had a long commitment to the international, and I think the idea of having a special program committed to increasing your sophistication is really terrific. I think it's good that we're talking about trafficking as an issue today, and I want to say a little bit about what it is from a legal perspective, and I'm very grateful to Kathy for kind of laying it out. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of a skeptical voice about our current preoccupation with trafficking. How many of you have heard of trafficking as an issue? If you look around, you will see this is an extraordinarily highly visible problem. Trafficking is not a new problem, right? It's been around for a long time. We've had slavery, but it has become a really hot issue in the last 10 or 15 years. So the point that I want to make here today is both what trafficking is and something about why we're so concerned with it. What exactly does that concern mean, and what kinds of efforts are being made to deal with it? And I'm going to do a little critique of the use of quantitative data here. So when we ask what trafficking is, it probably suggests to you that it has something to do with movement across borders. But that's not the case, actually. This is where it began, but increasingly we're defining trafficking in terms of two criteria. One is how are you recruited to this kind of labor, and the second is what kind of labor is involved. So this is about recruitment by force, fraud, or coercion to exploitative labor. And this is sort of the core definition of it. And it's kind of what we're finding is that the thing that we're discussing here has a very shifting identity, and different people define it in different ways. So I'm going to begin by giving you, and one of the major issues is, are we talking about sex trafficking, women being trafficked into the sex trade, or are we talking about labor trafficking? And the problem all along, and this must be a little confusing as you hear about it, because sometimes it's sex trafficking, sometimes it's labor trafficking. The problem is that the sex trafficking piece of this has much higher visibility and interest and enthusiasm, and it picks up the kind of quintessential popular issue, which is innocent, vulnerable young women being sexually violated. And that's the topic that really gets people going. Now, innocence is important here. I started studying violence against women, looking at domestic violence, and it had that quality. And then over time, it turns out that the battered woman was not always innocent. Maybe she was fighting back. Maybe she was drinking too. And we sort of lost the enthusiasm for that as an issue. Then we turned to children, right? Children being victims. And that seems to be more appealing. The advantage of trafficking as an issue is you, by definition, assume that the victim is innocent. But in fact, if you look closely at what's really happening, there are often people who are making choices to get into exploitative labor situations because it may be the best option they have, or maybe they want to travel, or maybe they want consumer goods, which doesn't mean that it's the kind of a choice that a person who's got resources and good choices would make. It may be the kind of a choice that a person who's in a violent marriage or facing poverty and starvation or tired of living in a small community, they might make this kind of choice. So we have to be more sophisticated about how people get involved in trafficking. So we initially thought most trafficking was for sex work. Now we think most of it is for labor trafficking, but labor trafficking is really hard to pin down. And so you see this tension in the field. And it ends up that we are actually talking mostly about women and children, although probably the number of people labor trafficked is greater. So I have here, there are two major definitions. This is the U.S. government's Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000 by Congress. This was a kind of a liberal feminist view. And you see it defines trafficking sort of bizarrely as sex trafficking for a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, so that there's this coercive entrance into the job. And then the second part B refers to labor trafficking. So again, we see sex trafficking and labor trafficking put together, again with the use of force, fraud, or coercion to get into it, and then involuntary servitude, exploitative labor. Okay, so this is the law that then created the U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, this is sort of a unilateral U.S. move. There is also an international protocol called the Palermo Protocol, also passed in 2000. So you see this is a new issue. And it's got an interesting difference from the U.S. one. This was the result of international collaboration, but here you see it has similar language, except it adds the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability as one of the ways that you can get recruited into being a trafficked victim. So what this does is radically expand the conditions under which you can be trafficked, so that if you're poor, if you're in a violent marriage, these are all conditions that are vulnerabilities that might lead you to get into trafficking. And this definition, I assume you can read this, includes prostitution or the exploitation of the prostitution of others. Now, the question here is very murky, is consent. What if a person chooses to be a sex worker? And this constrains the conditions under which a person can choose to be a sex worker. So if you're in any way coerced or under a position of vulnerability, then you are by definition trafficked, or if you're under 18. So children by definition cannot consent to either exploitative labor or sex trafficking. Now, why does this matter? This matters because trafficking has become a huge battleground within feminism, and there are two dominant positions. There's one position, which is called an abolitionist position, that says this is an inherently exploitative position for women, that prostitution is always a violation of their rights, and therefore it can never be consented to. A woman would never choose to do this, and so this anti-prostitution wing was the group that put in this condition of vulnerability, and what it says is the number of people who can actually consent to be prostitutes is very small. The second group, the more liberal feminists, say, there may be women who actually choose to do this, and we should then think of these people as sex workers. And instead of trying to criminalize them and eliminate prostitution altogether, we should say, look, this is a kind of labor. Let's improve the conditions of labor for sex workers. And so the sex worker group would say, all right, let's regulate payment. Let's make it legal. Let's see how this could be a less exploitative kind of work. You can see why feminists are on both sides. It's radical feminists and evangelical Christians tend to be on the abolitionist side. This was where George Bush was, and so a lot of the early TIP report took this perspective. The more liberal feminists, which actually included Hillary Clinton and the TVPA legislation, were more inclined to say not all prostitution is inherently violence and that a woman could, in fact, consent. The public health community is on the sex worker side because they say if you're going to control STDs, HIV/AIDS, you need to have this a more open, public, recognized behavior, and therefore you can have some kind of policing. It's a provocative and difficult fight. It has divided feminists. I think that probably everything else being equal, this is not a kind of work that people might choose to do. On the other hand, for women in many conditions, this may be a better choice than some other choice. And we certainly have cases of women who get enough wealth to buy a house, to go home, to have support their families, who use this as a kind of a temporary way of getting money. And the really important point in this is that sex work is a highly stratified activity. So you get some people who are on the top. Remember Elliot Spitzer and his call girls, $10,000, whatever? So these are people who are highly educated, right, college degrees help, who are getting a lot of money, who are not exploited, and then there are people in brothels, and then there are people who are working on the street. And so there are women who get trafficked who end up in the bottom of this hierarchy, often in brothels where they're abused and they're not paid. Sometimes those women over time manage to get in a better position and make more money. Sometimes they actually become madams. Sometimes they work in the trafficking trade, but other times they're clearly just victimized and they want to be rescued. So it's a highly complicated world. I think that may be all I have on my PowerPoints, yes. So then I'll get my website in a second. So what produces this? Economic inequality, as Kathy said, is a core concern. I want to talk very briefly about how we're dealing with it. We could either take a labor rights approach or what's popular now, a slavery approach, calling this slavery. There are two kind of different ways of handling it. The dominant approach right now is the criminal justice approach. Prosecute the traffickers. As Kathy says, we prosecute very few. This, I think you maybe noticed the Indian diplomat who brought a maid without a visa who's now being prosecuted as a trafficker. And so we have actually, some of our prosecutions are really diplomats bringing maids. Typically the people who get prosecuted are not those kingpin organized crime figures, but maybe the brothel madams or the people who are much closer to the person who's been trafficked. So this has not been a successful strategy, but it's one that we see as the dominant one. A second approach is the rescue approach, where organizations will go into brothels and seize women or sometimes laborers and then help them to escape. The trouble with this approach is that we know very little about what happens to them afterwards. Often it seems that they go right back where they were because the pressures that got them there in the first place are taking them back there again. Last week I was in Utah at a conference on trafficking by people in Utah looking at trafficking in Salt Lake City, and they came across 58 Thai people who were doing some kind of work in Salt Lake, I think in a chicken farm. And they rescued them, but then what do you do with them? And they were then confronting the need to rehabilitate and so on. So the problem of rescue is a failure to really think through how you're going to handle the post-rescue moment. It's a very appealing idea, isn't it? And I've heard people get very excited about it. It puts you in the position of the savior, rescuing these poor, benighted people. But it doesn't really deal with the kind of systemic factors that Kathy has been mentioning. Okay, there are two other approaches that we have used, one of which, okay, can you put this one on, is the Trafficking in Persons Report. Do I understand you all have this and you've looked at it? So this is an interesting approach. This is a strategy that the U.S. government has made. It's very unilateral. The U.S. set out its principles of behavior. It's a very criminal justice-focused approach. Every country in the world is, no, not quite all, but most of them are ranked in terms of their compliance with the U.S. standards. They're divided into tiers. We have these tiers here. And let's see. Interestingly, the law enforcement data is up front and center. There was a particular law that said this data had to be provided, but notice that we have data on prosecutions, convictions, and victims identified. Check out the number of victims, 45,000. This is not the 27 million you hear. We know so little about how many people are involved. And of course, there's so many ambiguities about the definition that it's hard to know. The number of prosecutions are very small. So this system, as you all probably know, we're going to pass through the heroes here. Here are the tiers, right? This system has punishments for countries in Tier 3. And the U.S. will withdraw aid. It will speak against them when they try to get foreign assistance. It is a concern for particular poor donor-dependent countries, less so for other countries, and to some extent can you read this? The tier placements, you see the tier 3s are the U.S. enemies list. They used to have a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and now we do it this way, which is a little less visible. I think North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela are all 3s, but also countries like Saudi Arabia who are U.S. allies. So politics is undoubtedly involved, but it's not all politics. There is some data gathering. And in case this is too small, we have nice maps by countries, which show, you can't get this. Can you get this online, the color-coded? Now, sometimes I worry because the good, bad is, there are always these maps and these quantitative indicators, and the good countries are typically green and the bad countries are typically red. And to some extent, it's the colonial world mapped again, where the good people are, Europe, US, Australia, and the bad people are always Africa and Asia. Russia has these bars because the Congress passed a law in 2008 that if you're in the Tier 2 watch list for 2 years, you automatically fall into Tier 3, which is where Russia and China are right now. So again, I don't mean to be cynical, but it is kind of the colonial map going on here. Okay, so that's one approach. Make this visible, apply sanctions. It has had some impact on visibility. Some countries have changed their behavior. There has been a deep critique of the criminal justice approach, but it has at least raised visibility. Now, I want to look at the second. How can you find me the other one? So here's a new indicator. I'm writing a book on indicators, and I'm skeptical about this kind of information, in case you haven't gathered that. But this is a new indicator, just came out in the fall. Have any of you heard the number 27 million to describe the number of modern slaves in the world? How many of you have heard this? So it doesn't have as much visibility as the trafficking. There are some scholars who say we shouldn't be talking about trafficking, we should be talking about modern slavery. There are others who say modern slavery is a very specific form of behavior, that trafficking is wider, but who knows. And this measure of modern slavery actually includes child brides and sex workers and a little vague who else. But the thing that's interesting to me about this is a very cool little map interface, because you can look at any country and find out what its rank. 1 is worst, 160 is the best. And here you have the number of slaves in this country. Can you imagine that? And here you have even more statistics. The number of slaves, the population, GDP, it's tier 3 on the TIP report. So it looks like we really have good specific information about how many slaves we have, which of course we don't at all. I've been trying to figure out where this data came from, and it's very sketchy. So here's India. There are 2 or 3, how do you know how many slaves? You've got to figure out how you're defining it, and are you going to do it? You should do a representative sample survey, he says. But the best data I found for this is a survey done in Eastern Europe asking people, has anybody in your family traveled to another country and had their passport taken away, worked without pay, or been subjected to violence and exploitative labor? Now, does that tell you what's going on in Mauritania? Anyway, India also, what did I do wrong? Why isn't it flicking on me? Oh, I know, it's because I already have this data here. Okay, so here's India. And I'm going to do one more country, the good one. So we're 134, so we're pretty good. We're not as good as the best. The best, up here, is Iceland. Has fewest slaves in the world. They still have less than 100 slaves. Anyway, I raise this as yet another example of producing data that will make things known, but data that you might need to be actually skeptical about. So to sum up, this is indeed a major problem, but we know very little about it. It's actually very susceptible to being used for fundraising and generating interest. We need to focus really much more carefully on what exactly the problem is and where it is, and to get really more effective policies than we currently have. Okay, so thank you.
Can we start from the beginning? Yeah. Okay. So, thank you. All right. So, first I want to thank the Albright Institute and my co-panelists for having me join the discussion today. It's an honor to be here, and it's a privilege to talk to such a good-looking group on Friday. What I want to cover today are two things. Why is trafficking in persons an international security issue? And I'd like to talk a little bit about UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and how it can be used as a counter-trafficking strategy. But first, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a couple questions. How do you define security? When we say the word security, what does that mean to you? Anybody? Yeah.
You're out of harm's way.
Out of harm's way. Okay. So it's physical security. Anyone else? Yep.
I think it can be emotional or spiritual too. You might have like the physical conditions around you that are safe, but internally you might not feel a sense of.
It's a personal, yeah, okay.
Access to opportunity to maintain a stable life.
Okay, so maybe economic security?
Economic
Education,
education.
okay. Did you want to, yeah?
I immediately thought of national security.
Mm-hmm.
So threats to your country, things like that.
Threats to state territory,
Yeah, or
right?
the
From other states?
Right,
Yeah.
or like the citizens within the state, or terrorist threats.
Threats to citizens, and so state to state insecurity, but also internally, civilians being insecure, yeah.
Not having to worry about whatever it is you're worrying about. So I'm thinking about water security, where you don't have to worry about getting enough water.
Okay,
getting
so
enough-
environmental security, right? A couple more?
lack of fear for the future.
Okay.
So, I guess this ties into everything, but you feel like you don't have to worry about something bad happening in the near future or in the far future.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah.
Since then, one has an ability to flourish without interruption.
Mm-hmm. So a safe environment, safe living standards is what you're saying. And one more, anyone? Last one?
Just maintaining social stability.
Maintaining social stability. Okay. So I want you to keep those ideas in your back pocket. And I want to touch on what Kathy and Sally have already talked about extensively, is human trafficking, modern day slavery. This is sort of the face of what we think of trafficking. As they both pointed out, we really think about sex trafficking as this is the sum of the problem. I want to ask you also, how many people in the room have experience with trafficking in persons, have worked on it? Please stand up. How many people in the room drink coffee? Please stand up. How many people in the room eat chocolate? Please stand up. Okay, so that's everybody. I'm standing too, because I eat a lot of chocolate. So my point here is that we are all implicated in trafficking in persons, because chocolate and coffee are one of the two major industries that use forced labor and child labor to produce the products. Okay, so if we're all complicit in trafficking, should we all go to jail? Is that the solution to the problem? Probably not, right? Probably not. You can sit down. So we know that trafficking looks like this too, right? But we have, as Sally went over very specifically and carefully, the definition of trafficking. It's about, people talked about this earlier, it's about exploitation, right? This is what it says on paper. But what does it really look like? And Kathy has shown some of these pictures. Now I want to show you a clip, and it's 2 minutes long, and I want you to pay attention to it and think about some of the things that Kathy and Sally have shared with you as we watch the clip, and I'm going to ask you some questions about it afterwards.
مادر و پدرش میگیم که باید شاگرد تربیت میکنیم. باز اونها اجازه میدن؟ بله ها. چیزی وعده میکنیم؟ پیسه میتیم. یعنی شما اکثرا بچه‌ای میرین که وضع زندگیشان خوب نیست، غریب است. غریب است، اینا تو نیست. ششور میباشی؟ اینا شاگرد میگیرم نگاه بکنم. اینا را از وقت میشناختی؟
نه.
Yeah, you can stop it now. All right. So, has anybody seen this film? Okay, this is sorry, I didn't give you the background before. It's a documentary by Frontlines called The Dancing Boys of Afghanistan. The Dancing Boys of Afghanistan, that's English, the cultural, or I shouldn't say cultural practice, but the practice in Afghanistan is called Bachabazi, and that means dancing boys. And young boys specifically are targeted for sex trafficking. So I wanted to ask you, what did you see in this clip that Kathy and Sally had brought up earlier that's you noticed about what we could sort of talk about trafficking as different? Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for showing us that clip. I just had a question, since I'm assuming like this was a documentary that was made. What happened to this boy? Like, did the people making the documentary put him out of harm's way of this man? What happened to him?
So you should definitely watch it. It's online for free. You can download PBS. But what happened is that the boy was sold. He was with the guy who bought him. And then eventually the documentary makers tried to free him, track him down, and free him and rescue him, and they did eventually. And what had happened, what you saw here is that the boy was sold by someone who said they were his uncle, but it wasn't his uncle. It was just a neighbor or someone who sold him to that man who's driving the car, and that man who's driving the car is a businessman, is a very kind of respected businessman in his town or village. But I recommend you watching the film, but also it's very disturbing. It's very upsetting for me to watch it, pretty disgusting, but very important to know why. And I'm going to get some more comments. I'm going to tell you why I showed you this clip. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I was surprised just the kind of like lack of drama surrounding it. I think when we think of human trafficking, we think of, I've always thought of just abduction or just people being forcibly taken from their homes or where they come from. And it was just really impacting to just kind of like the calmness of it, that the boy literally just like willingly walked in, sat down. There was no force of violence used in taking him from his home.
Okay, so it kind of really shows you the vulnerability of people. Go ahead, over here.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I noticed that the man driving the car seems to realize that good targets tend to be very poor. And I guess he's using their socioeconomic status as an indicator of whether they'd be good for taking away. And going off of your point, I was also very surprised that the child seemed to think of this as normal and didn't really put up a fight against the man driving the car.
Okay, great. So it tells us a lot about vulnerability, economic, social, but also power differentials between children and adults, too, in a cultural context, right? So now, over here.
I was thinking about how when we normally have, or typically when there's conversations about human trafficking, I've noticed that it tends to be about young girls, young women, but this is a young boy. So I think just giving a different perspective that it's not just women who are affected, but that this is something that goes on to goes along with our assumptions about the human body, that it goes far beyond just young girls.
Okay, good. So not girls, boys. Go ahead.
Thank you for being here. Also, the level of impunity. He did this in the middle of broad daylight. There were people around. Everyone seemed to be watching him as if they knew what was going on. And the businessman didn't have his face blurred out in the documentary. He was clearly knew that he was being recorded, and he had no fear.
Right. So a person in a position of power is able to perform very criminal activities in broad daylight. Right. Go ahead.
I have a question. What would happen when they see this respected businessman taking a child who then doesn't return to his family? Wouldn't there be some sort of repercussion or knowledge of what happened? I'm wondering why.
So that's a good question, and I'm gonna come back to why I showed the clip. But that's great.
Okay,
Keep
thanks.
that in mind. Yeah. I'll take one or two more, and then because I want to get to an exercise I want to do with you. Yeah.
Watching this video reminded me that a lot of attention is often brought to documentaries that portray human trafficking happening elsewhere, not in the United States, and how that changes our perception of things too.
Right. Okay. And what did you notice about in this? Is it across borders?
No, it's within.
It's
the country,
internally
yeah.
in the country, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the community also seemed like one, clearly not affluent, where people might not have the energy, time, or be able to even consider what neighbors might be going through. They have their own problems to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So it's in Afghanistan, right? It's during a conflict that's been going on for years and years, quite unstable situation, right? Okay, take two more. So you, and there's somebody in the back, yeah.
I'm very surprised the man was okay with it being filmed, his face being on TV. It just makes it seem also normal. I found that very shocking, putting myself there.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Also touching on Noura's point, I was thinking about Ms. Blakeslee's point about the use of technology and the influence of that, and how the media can play a role in this sort of situation, whether for harm or for good. In this situation, potentially for good, if they can track this individual and get the boy back into safety. So that was just something that I thought about, and that I was also surprised at the willingness and the responses that were quite honest to the documentary producer.
Okay, great. So why did I show you that clip? Okay, so earlier was mentioned that I work with militaries and government organizations and international organizations to implement something called Security Council Resolution 1325. How many people here know about UN 1325 or have heard of Women, Peace, and Security? So a few of you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but it was a Security Council resolution passed in the year 2000 on women, peace, and security, and it said a couple of really important things. It said, one, that the Security Council, right, the highest level of security decision-making in the world that we have today, right, says in that resolution that equality between men and women is intrinsically linked to the maintenance of international peace and security. It says that women must have a voice in all decision-making matters about international peace and security, such as peacemaking and peace negotiations, and we have to have attention to gender equality, right? And the other really important thing it says, and it recognizes by putting women and women's voices into discussions of international security and peace, is that it says it's no longer state-to-state relations and state-to-state borders that matter as our primary idea of traditional security. It is actually individual, human security. All of the things that you talked about in the very beginning of our conversation, right, including the borders that you mentioned, state-to-state relations, including feeling vulnerable, making sure that in your future you have opportunities, environmental security, food security, all of those things matter to international peace and security. And the way that they matters how each of us is treated by the state, our individual security, what we saw in that clip. So why did I show you that clip? I showed you that clip because I work with NATO because they were confronting this problem in Afghanistan. And when they went to Afghanistan, they expected the picture on the right. That's the traditional view of security, right? You go in, it's a war zone, and you're fighting in combat. But what they ended up experiencing also was dealing with the local civilian population on a very regular basis. And that's the reality on the ground. And so what was happening with the NATO officers and soldiers that I was training and working with is that because they were mandated, NATO has been mandated by all of our governments, right, to go in and to train the new Afghan police force, to stand up the new National Afghan Army, right? They were interacting a lot with their local counterparts in the security sector. And one thing that constantly happened is, they would make friends with these, the police or, the new judges or the new security forces, and they would be invited to a lot of social gatherings. And one of the social gatherings that they were repeatedly invited to were cultural events. These events where there was music and these dancing boys. Now, those NATO officers and soldiers, they went there because they thought, oh, well, we're finally getting invited and building this rapport with the local population, and we have to, this is part of our patrol route, this is part of our information gathering, we have to be there, we have to, show the reputation. But what happened by them being there? Their presence at those events actually sanctioned this criminal activity. It violates international humanitarian law. It violates international human rights standards and human rights laws, right? And the NATO forces didn't realize what this was. They did not know the cultural context. They thought as well, like people here have said, they didn't think that boys were being trafficked. It's women and girls that are trafficked. They didn't think about, oh, this isn't a cross-border thing. This isn't a migration problem or immigration problem. These people are all Afghanis, right? Oh, this is not a problem because guess what? That local businessman is sitting there. The police chief is here. That guy from the, courthouse, he's sitting there. Just like you saw it, just like you guys said. So easy for that guy to show his face and just talk about what he was going to do, that he was going to buy a child for sex. So the NATO officers were confronted with this, and they needed to know, how do I identify this problem? Like, what situation before I get into it? And then, what do I do when I'm in that situation? And how can I even prevent that situation from happening, right? So now that we know what the problem is, right, and we talked about a lot of these issues about vulnerability, the fact that this isn't conflict, the fact that there's a power differential, right? Talked a little bit. I'm going to go really just click over these other slides really quickly because these are things that have already been brought up by Kathy and Sally about the related problems. And the two forms of trafficking. We know about sex trafficking, labor, blah, 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 faces of trafficking, vulnerabilities. I just want to point out systematic vulnerabilities, right? We're not just talking about individual people. This is a structural problem, right? Institutions are made of people, right? And we're all participating in this, just like we talked about with the chocolate and the coffee. Are we separate from those things if we're buying them and participating on a daily basis? No. All right, so just want to stop here for a moment to underline, just keep in mind, to go back to this discussion of security. So when those NATO officers are sitting in that environment, it undermines security. It creates political instability. Why? Because it's legitimizing corrupt power figures and criminal activity in this population, right? And what is it saying to the local population? It's saying that that actually those forces that are there to protect and serve them and to build up this new state are actually there to exploit them and to abuse the power that they've gotten. And that's not what we want to do. And it absolutely undermines governance and the rule of law. Because then, as you asked in the beginning, Barrett, well, what happens? Like, isn't somebody going to prosecute them? How could he not get arrested, right? So we're talking about systemic inequality and corruption and violence. That is not the violence that we think of every day, of physical violence, right? So what do we do about it, right? That's the question. We know all these things, very complicated problem. What do we do about it? So this is what we bring back to, so what do those NATO soldiers do? They said, okay, we have this policy on 1325, now we've got this directive, and it says we're supposed to do something on gender-based violence, and this is a big problem. So now how do we use this resolution? And as I said before, the Security Council passed this resolution on 1325 to increase the contributions of women's voices in decision-making about conflict resolution and sustainable peace. It has 4 pillars, just like trafficking has the 3 Ps of, what are the 3 Ps of trafficking? Who knows? Prevention, protection, prosecution. Okay. Prevention, protection, prosecution. Remember that, because I have an exercise for you. So these are the 4 pillars. The goals of 1325: to reduce violence, increase protection, stop perpetuation of gender inequality, to promote gender equality. And these are the policies that followed afterwards. And we actually have about 40 national action plans, and the US has a national action plan, and there's some things that are happening in Washington this week that I'll tell you about at the end. But now I want to do an exercise with you. How much time do we have for like 12, 15? Okay, 5 minutes. All right, so what I'd like you to do is turn to the person on your right, and you're pairing up, and I'm gonna need some help actually passing these slips out to the pairs. And I want you to read each the slip that I give you and discuss with your partner, is this a strategy that would go under prevention, protection, or prosecution? Okay, you have like 3 minutes because we don't have much time. Two people, yeah. 2 pairs, yeah, they're pairing up, yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing is I'm giving you guys a cheat sheet that you share with each other. So just take 1 per pair. 1 per pair. Can you? Yeah. One per pair. Share. You gotta share. So you have 3 minutes.
Take special measures. So I feel like it implies it's already going on. That's why you're going in. Right. So you. So it's not prosecution. You haven't gotten that far.
It's not prevention because we're assuming that it's already going on. Don't go into armed conflict, right?
Since our time is really short. And I want to allow for question and answers if you have them for Kathy and Sally as well. I'm going to ask you to tell me who has number 4. Point number 4. Can you read it out, please? Oh, yeah.
Further urges the Secretary General to seek to expand the role and contribution of women in the United Nations field-based operations, and especially among military observers, civilian police, human rights, and humanitarian personnel.
Okay. So what did you guys think that would address?
We were going with prevention.
Prevention because
we didn't really get to that part yet.
It's okay.
I think, well, my initial reaction is that women have different perspectives than men. So maybe women would be able to help pick out the signs of trafficking better. But, I mean, I haven't really thought about that point.
Okay. All right. And so who has number 6?
Oh, sure.
Can you read that out, please?
Requests the Secretary General to provide to member states training guidelines and materials on the protection, rights, and the particular needs of women, as well as on the importance of involving women in all peacekeeping and peace-building measures, invites member states to incorporate these elements as well as HIV/AIDS awareness training into their national training programs for military and civilian police personnel in preparation for deployment, and further requests the Secretary General to ensure that civilian personnel of peacekeeping operations receive similar training.
Okay. And so what did you think about that?
We thought it was prevention.
It was also prevention because
there's training.
Yeah, because they ask member states to provide training.
Provide training. Okay. All right. So you basically got a taste of the resolution. I think you all have a PDF of 1325, and I think it's really important to read through the resolution and see exactly what it says for yourself, because this document was created by women from conflict zones around the country who have no army, no power, no money, but were able to go to the highest level of security decision-making in the world and change our concept of security and say, this is what's happening on the ground. We can no longer think about security as just being a tank or a gun. It has to be about the dignity of human life, right? And individual security has to be a state security concern when we discuss these matters at this level. Okay, so I thank you very much for the time, and I want to leave time for question and answers because I know Kathy and Mary probably also have questions for them too. Thank you.
We have almost 10 minutes now, and so we want to ask you all any questions, any comments.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation today. All of you talked about sex trafficking. My question is, and Ms. Merry and Ms. Blakeslee also mentioned that few women also choose to go into prostitution for economic purposes to support their families and themselves. How can we reintegrate these women who want to come back and get jobs, start a normal life per se?
I think I'll say something to that. There is not much done in this country about it. As I said before, the United States has been the, slowest, I think, to admit that this goes on now, so we don't have the services. In other countries, they have made efforts. Now, it's a drop in the bucket, but there are shelters for trafficked victims, and the shelters include training, some kind of an economic training and rehabilitation, and if possible, they can reunite them with their families or villages, but it's often not possible because their families and neighbors may have been complicit in the trafficking. But in Cambodia, from one of the shelters, they've gotten about 10 young women jobs with Kodak. I mean, they have to relate to the local businesses and see what they can do. There are others where they've gotten them into a catering service. Now, the traditional has been telling them how to do hairdressing, but you know, you can only use so many hairdressers. So they have to find other kinds of things, but it is extremely difficult. They're stigmatized. Some of them think, well, I'm ruined for life. I can't do anything else. A lot of them can't return to their communities. In Vietnam, they set up a legal services system for Vietnamese girls who were trafficked to Cambodia and then returned. But there was such stigma in Vietnam about having been trafficked that they wouldn't take advantage of this legal service. And in Vietnam, if you're out of your particular district for more than 6 months, you are supposed to report that you're leaving. So these girls were taken to Cambodia. They get back a few years or more later. Nothing's been reported. What do they do to get themselves back in the system? But they wouldn't admit they were trafficked. So there are great difficulties in dealing with this. That's why I said it's a lifelong effect coming from this. And I think the rest of the world may have a bigger problem than the U.S., but they have also tried to be resourceful in figuring out what to do. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. It's my understanding that there's potentially an increase in human trafficking activities around big events like the Olympics or even the Super Bowl here in the U.S., and that there are certain initiatives that have been taken to train enforcement officials and raise awareness at a community level, such as reaching out to hotels and things like that. I was just wondering if you could comment on those initiatives and whether or not you think they've been effective.
Well, I'll say that there was a great deal of concern about the human trafficking in South Africa with the World Cup. And UNICEF and some others really tried to take some actions to prevent it. Now, there's been less that they've actually proven and found than they maybe expected. But there was something that happened that this was another policy of the South African government decided. They were going to close all the schools for 30 days because in the name of democracy, everybody should be able to see the World Cup. So they set up these big TV screens in so-called fan parks. Well, so all these school children who were out of school were going there, and they were, of course, sitting ducks for anybody that wanted to do anything to them. And they tried to, UNICEF and others, talk the government out of that policy, but they wouldn't be talked out of it, so what they did was send monitors to these fan parks to keep an eye on what was going on. But there's so many things that can happen. Now, we are worried about Rio. And we know that there'll be children involved, although the prostitution was legal, so the sex workers union has been giving free English lessons to the sex workers so they can operate better. There's concern. In Athens, they cleaned up all the brothel areas and repainted them and everything. And in Athens, they were trafficking young children from Albania to beg. So it's hard. People are aware. And I think there's less actual evidence of how much of this there was, but some of it. And I hesitate to say, but the U.S. military has been involved in some of this as well. It's just a fact. Yeah.
So I'm sure you're all familiar with Half the Sky, Cheryl Wu Dunn's book. And she and her husband write about some of the issues that they came across when they were traveling throughout Southeast Asia. And one of the stories they share is that when they spoke with a border police officer in one of those countries, they asked, why don't you ever try to stop any of this if you know that it's going on? And he shared his opinion that, quite frankly, these girls that are being sex trafficked are not of the same stature as, they're like better girls, quote unquote, in the socioeconomic status-wise, and he said that they need to be quote unquote sacrificed for men to have pleasure. And I think that sort of frames a very deep-seated issue in history, tradition, culture that sort of is difficult, I would imagine, to penetrate from a place such as the United Nations Security Council all the way through that barrier. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how you start at the bottom and work your way through that.
That's really difficult. I mean, that's a whole culture change. And part of what we're talking about here is culture and what is culturally accepted in these countries. And you have to do it from the bottom up. I mean, you can't just do it from the top. And it's incredibly difficult. There's a lot of training that needs to take place to explain this. And the U.S. government funded a police training film in Cambodia called Saving Sika. And it's very good. It's on the internet, on YouTube, Saving Sika, S-E-C-A. And it's a drama, but it's used with the Cambodian Film Company and Asia Foundation and the U.S. government to train these policemen. And it was the end of a long story after the government closed the brothels and the police rounded up the girls and were accused of abusing them, and there was a big scandal about it. So we decided we'd do some police training on gender sensitivity, and the film that they did came out to be so good I was stunned. Sahana, you were standing behind me, weren't you?
Yeah.
We gave them the funding, and like 9 months later, they sent a CD from Cambodia, and I wanted to see if I could see it in my computer, and Sahana was in my office, and we start watching this, and we couldn't stop watching it. It's really quite gripping, and now they've done 4 of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Anyway, you can find that on YouTube. So training is important.
And can I just add?
Yeah.
There's also this movement of men who are becoming involved in engaging in promoting gender equality and ending violence against women. And there's many organizations around the world that are basically male activists that are actually working directly on this behavior change issue with other men. And so you should look up Men Engage Alliance. You should look up Sonke, it's S-O-N-K-E, Gender Justice Network, which is in South Africa. And there's Promundo, which is in Brazil, but also has an office in Washington, D.C. There are many others. But it's really good for you to know about those activities that they're doing with men from the bottom up, as you say, directly addressing traditional gender roles and stereotypes individually to change behavior. And of course, it's a very slow process, but it's a very important one.
If I can just add one more piece, one of the difficulties of the criminal justice approach is that it assumes that police are reliable, that the courts will act, and the police aren't actually trying to take advantage of these situations, which, as you all know, is completely unrealistic. And lest we think that's only the case in other countries, many years ago I studied prostitutes in Boston, streetwalkers, and they described having the police come along, tell them to pay a fine, asking for sex. I mean, this is, and they have to be paid off by the pimps. So the complicity of the police in this business is a serious concern, which is why these other organizations are really important. And we see training as a solution to everything. But when I was working with police on domestic violence, they said that what really matters is not training the police so much as getting the supervisors to value that kind of activity. And the police really take the leadership of the supervisors very seriously. So if we just think about the violence against women movement for a moment, it's been 30 or 40 years of sustained activism to redefine this as a serious crime that police need to act on, and it needs to be continually reiterated. So it can be done. We see it has happened in this case. Hasn't ended violence, but has changed attitudes, and can be done with trafficking as well.
Yeah, and I just want to say to Sally's point that absolutely men and male leaders need to be engaged on these issues, because that is the only way that the NATO policy, for example, got implemented, because we had a 4-star general who said, this is important. We have to do it, and we're seeing real results on the ground in our ability to maintain security. So we have to engage men. It cannot only be women on this issue.
Well, I think we've run out of time. I think.
Please join me in thanking you.